know you told me such a long time ago that you didn't want me. You said you didn't love me no more. I wanna know.
Meze surprised everyone a few years back when they went from making $300 headphones in the form of the 99 Classics to making the $3,000 Meze Empyrean flagship high-end headphones. And now, of course, they have the $4,000 Meze Elites. Now, the $3,000 Empyreans impressed me so much that I bought them, although not everyone was completely happy with the sound. Well, now we have the new Meze Empyrean Mark II, and this has some significant changes to this sound. So as an exclusive first look, I'm going to take you through the design as well as my impressions of the sound, and of course, as usual, compared to other flagship high-end headphones, as well as through a variety of gear down from dongle DACs through to high-end gear. So stick around and let's get started with the design of the new Meze Empyrean Mark II.
But I still wanna know what makes me such a fool for you.
Essentially, not much has changed with the new Empyrean IIs as far as external design is concerned. Well, obviously, except that these are almost completely black. You still have that carbon fiber headband, which gives you enough clamping force to keep them comfortably on your ears, although maybe not enough clamping force if you're so inclined towards air guitar work. You still have the reverse curve leather headpad, which when you put them on gives you a greater contact patch on your head, meaning that you do get more comfort when wearing them for longer periods. You can also adjust them as usual using some firm pressure up or down to give you more space or less space as required, and they'll stay fairly much in place without shifting too much when you take them off and put them on again multiple times. But the one area in when things have really changed is the ear pads, because the stock ear pads are no longer leather. They are what they call dual ear pads, or what the rest of the world calls hybrid ear pads. If you remember the Elites here, they had Alcantara on the inside and leather on the outside. Reverse that for the Empyreans, as you have leather on the inside and Alcantara on the outside to make their dual ear pads. Now also the original Empyreans and the Elites came with similarly shaped Alcantara ear pads, but now you have included in the box the new angled Alcantara ear pads with the wider opening for a considerable change in the sound tuning. So you get essentially two tunings in one in the box with these. Also, the stock cable is now what used to be the upgrade cable for the Elites and the Empyreans, and is the highest quality cable that they sell. So you no longer have that issue of buying a pair of headphones and then wondering if you have to spend $500 extra for the upgrade cable or a third-party cable to get the most out of them. And I think that's a really good thing to include. They also come in a smaller case than before, so if you do it'll feel like taking them somewhere, you can do so readily. Most significantly, what has changed with the Empyrean Mark II is the tuning. So as usual, I have listened with them with a variety of music through everything from dongle DACs to stacks of shit through to high-end gear. And not only that, but I took them round to a friend's house to listen as well. Those of you who are familiar with my channel may remember Stefan from the non-audiophile videos. Although if you're wondering where are my original pair of Empyreans, well, Stefan liked them so much that he bought them from me. And so I took them round to his house to do a comparison with the old and new Empyreans. And so not only will you get my impressions shortly, but you'll get some of his. To ensure that I got the best out of these headphones possible, I of course started with Chord's TT2M scaler, which I get the maximum resolution out of, but also I used high quality recordings from Native DSD, who I'm happy to say are sponsoring this video. I sought out Native DSD because originally I bought the album which you are hearing in this video, Carmen Gomes Sings the Blues, and I'd actually like to thank Carmen Gomes for allowing me to use her music. While Native DSD did start out making available high-quality DSD recordings, they have recordings such as this one available in high-res PCM as well. This was originally a DXD track, which is in a high-res PCM format. And given that we spend so much money on all this gear, having available very high-quality recordings with very minimal mastering applied to them so that you get the maximum resolution out makes listening so much more satisfying. And Native DSD have a considerable catalogue of albums available from a variety of recording studios, including their own, which have just absolutely stunning detail. One of the criticisms of the original pair was that the sound tuning was a little bit too warm or too dark. And one of the significant changes is the sound signature is now considerably, I don't want to say brighter, but considerably less dark and less thick sounding than it was before. And that's probably the primary takeaway, along with what I think is a little bit more detail. Now, to explain what I'm hearing, I'm going to use some examples from two different systems. One is Clinical's site, which he used one particular system for measuring headphones, and also Meze kindly sent me some graphs so you can check out the differences between how the original Empyrean sounds and the new one, as well as the effect of the different ear pads. And I want to caution that measurements are a very complex science, and while there are a lot of discussion about what's relevant and what's not relevant, and what all the measurements mean, it's more useful in when getting an idea of why you're hearing a particular thing when you listen to it with a pair of headphones. So with that, I'd like to advise you not to read too much into measurements in general, but let's take a look at what some of the changes are. To start with, I'm going to look at Clinical's graph of the Meze Empyrean, and there are two versions he tested which had slightly different responses. You see one with slightly lower treble and one with slightly higher. Anyway, what I want to do note here is it may look fairly flat. Now, there is an original, what's called a target curve. Now, some people may be familiar with these, you may have heard of them, but what they aim to do is give an idea of what would be something like, I suppose, neutral. I mean, there was an IEF neutral target curve, which you can see there, which the Meze Empyrean kind of followed. And you'll see that in this, you see everything bass through to the mid-range is fairly flat. And then there's this hump here, which has to do with compensating for how our ears work, but that's something I won't go into. So you can consider this this is what I call technically flat. Now, there was an issue with this in that headphones that came out, over a decade ago, way back into the Odyssey headphones that came out, followed this as well. And to me and probably other people, around what we call the mid-bass area, which is where you hear most bass, they tended to sound a little bit thick. Now, there's other stuff, of course, to do with the higher ranges and how if you have a stronger kind of upper mid-range and treble, then you could make the bass sound like there's less bass, and correspondingly, if there's more bass, it may sound in relatively there's less treble. So for example, if you in this graph, for example, if you actually match the curve to this area, this lump here, then it would look like there was a shelf of elevated mid bass and bass all the way through. So you kind of get the idea in that how you line things up can make things a little bit more clear or a little bit less clear as things go. Now, of course, a later thing that came out, which you may have heard around because it's been bandied about all around the place, is the Harman target curve. Based on research by Sean Olive at Harman into roughly what a headphone should be tuned to sound something like a pair of high-end speakers in a fairly well-conditioned room. And you'll see that this shape is somewhat different. One thing to notice here, which is I want to particularly focus on, is this area in the mid-bass where it seems that the curve has a bit of a drop. And you'll see here that if you do a really funky thing you can do on Clinical's site, which is flatten the target curve to make it flat relative to the response, is that you see that the kind of mid-bass area and lower mid-range looks relatively thick if we're going to go along with this assumption that the Harman target curve is, well, I suppose neutral. The Harman target curve is kind of what I call listening neutral, and I say that because actually the bass part of the curve, if you actually look at the research, is an average of a bunch of responses from people, and there's a considerable variation in how much bass people like in headphones, and you'll see people argue about different headphones don't have enough bass for them or have too much, and that's where there's a lot of variation here. So don't read too much into this part of the curve. It's more this part I want in the middle where the mid bass is that I want to focus on, as well as actually later I'm going to talk about the upper mid range. So of course, if you flatten that out, you kind of get an idea of the kind of feeling that the Empyreans had, in that they felt like they didn't have enough kind of upper mid-range and maybe even treble, but they sounded kind of thick in what we might call the lower mid-range and mid-bass. So now if we go back to, for example, the Elite, what they did is they boosted the kind of upper mid-range and treble, so that it was kind of closer to the curve, but you still had a fairly kind of warm sound with the what we call the hybrid pads, which, as I pointed out, have a Alcantara in the middle and leather on the outside. Now, if you switch, of course, to the Alcantara pads, if you saw my review, then the sound changes, especially down in the low bass. It sounds kind of less bassy, and there's a bit more in the kind of upper mid-range area, but it's still a fairly warm pair of headphones. And in that, I want to just have a little bit of a focus on this area in the 2 kilohertz range, which relative to the Harman target curve, which I would call very loosely listening neutral, that is, a pair of headphones are designed to follow this curve, then they will probably have no particular excessive emphasis or de-emphasis in any particular frequency range. So you can kind of feel that the mid bass is a bit stronger and the upper mid range has a bit of a little bit of drop down from what you might call neutral. Now I want you to just keep that thought in mind as you look at the Elites with either with a hybrid or the Alcantara pads. And I want you to hold that in mind, because what we're going to switch to next is a look at the measurements that Meze sent me. And now they use a different system to what Critical uses. Critical has measurement rig based on a Grass 43AG-7, and the measurement rig used by Meze is slightly different. So bear in mind that these, and also the individual headphone unit variation, will mean that the curves look slightly different. But I want you to keep in mind this particular shape here, as I found it quite relevant to what I heard when I was listening to music with them. Okay, switching to the graphs from Meze, which is a GRAS or Grass 45CA with a different pin A. So do note that these graphs are not going to be quite the same as what Critical shows. If you look at the green line, this is the original Meze Empyrean with the leather ear pads, which was stock. And you'll see that area as be fairly low. It looks fairly similar to what Critical showed on his. Now, if you look at the purple line, that's the new Meze Empyrean II with the dual ear pads. Now, of course, like I said, it depends how you line these up as to kind of what you see, but you get a general idea as they seem to be kind of closest matching in the low bass and getting up towards the mid bass, where you get more of, well, you get less mid bass in a sense and more kind of a upper mid range treble in there. And so that means, if you line them up through the mid range, it would look like there's more bass and still yet more treble. And that should give you a basic idea of the kind of changes that they have. So they've gone from that, what you might call flatter looking sound with a kind of lower upper mid range treble, to one with considerably more upper mid range and treble and a bit pulled back in the kind of mid-range, if you're looking at relative to the bass. Or you can consider it that if the mid-range was matched up, then there's a fair bit more treble and actually a considerable amount of mid-bass. So again, it depends how you line it up, but it's close enough to give you an idea. Now, you also have, if we look at the Meze Empyrean and the Meze Empyrean II using the new Alcantara pads, so in this case, we're using the Meze Empyrean. It came with the stock Alcantara pads, and the Meze Empyrean II comes with the angled Alcantara pads. You'll see some similarity, but most significantly, you'll see a greater amount of kind of upper mid-range and treble with the newer pads. Now, you may want to pause this video at one point to have a closer look, as now we've got all four overlaid in here. We have the Meze Empyrean, the original one, with the green line in here, and you can see that lower treble there. You have the Meze Empyrean with the Alcantara pads with the blue line, or the cyan line. You have the Meze Empyrean II, the new one with the dual ear pads with the purple line, and the Meze Empyrean II with the angled Alcantara pads with the orange line. Now, another thing I want to note here is that relative to that Harman target curve, which you can't really apply to a different measuring rig than the one it was used in the research, but you will notice that the kind of between the, say, 1 kilohertz and the 3 kilohertz area, the rise is kind of a bit steeper than it is than the Harman target curve, except maybe, of course, the Meze Empyrean II with the dual ear pads comes a little bit closer. But still that kind of gap, and it's probably going to look different, with different unit variation, and that made me feel that this area, which is kind of, the mid-range area where there's a lot of vocal presence with a lot of instruments, is very slightly pulled back versus, well, again, what I call the essentially listening neutral. It does make vocals feel a touch warm and a very slight touch pulled back versus, again, other headphones which follow the Harman target curve more closely, such as Dan Clark Audio's Stealth, which is probably the closest you can get nowadays, at least in the high-end range. And so with that kind of, also with some degree of boosted bass up here, or mid-bass, they do sound kind of warm, but they don't sound so kind of forward And if you have like a more presence in the 2 kilohertz range, it does end up with the headphones sounding brighter or darker depending on how this range is. Even though we're not anywhere near up into kind of the treble area, it does affect it very strongly. So the overall sound signature, it's not particularly bright. I'd still say it's very in the warm side of things, as you can see with these the lines down here. But also there's more presence up in the kind of upper mid-range treble, but not so much that it kind of sounds very too forward, especially with that slight pullback here in the 2 kilohertz range. Now, there are at least one person online who considers that anything that doesn't follow the Harman target curve to be an imperfection, and given that, especially in the bass range, it's an average, I wouldn't consider this an imperfection. It's a particular idea about how to tune the headphones, and the overall result to me is that with a lot of music, it made it enjoyable to listen to, if maybe the timbre as a result of this slight pullback may not be quite as perfect as some people who are super picky may find to be good. As far as listening impressions go, I did that first, and I ran these in for a few days with some music playing so that any changes that the drivers might have after they have been manufactured have evened out, and they sound like they will to the final customer. In that regard, Meze are known not for running in their headphones, so there, at least for this pair, which was, I presume, first production, there were some changes, although how much any customer will experience changes may depend on how much they do testing and running in at the factory. Starting with that album I mentioned before, Carmen Gomes Sings the Blues, with using the stock dual earpads, Carmen's voice takes on an obvious warmth, and yet despite that, the cymbals in that come through quite clearly, and the percussion doesn't seem to interfere with other instruments. The vocals seem a touch pushed back, which I presume is probably from the slight drop at 2 kilohertz, and the overall sound is on the warm side, but with plenty of detail in the mid-range and treble regardless. Now, switching, for example, I decided to compare them to Vocal's 2022 version, as that's kind of something I've been using a lot lately. We find that the sound is actually just as warm, which means that the mastering of the track is probably quite warm. But the biggest difference with the Utopias is the increase in detail, both from the percussion as well as instruments. It's obviously a jump up $2,000. You'd expect to get a lot more detail, and the Utopias have a reputation, both with me and a lot of other people, as being very detailed headphones and very revealing of upstream equipment. Whereas I'd probably say that the Empyreans in comparison are somewhat more forgiving. As another comparison, Final's D8000s with the stock earpads have less of a heavy sound through the mid-bass, but also a feeling of a narrower soundstage. There is a slight vagueness to the soundstage as a result, whereas Gomez's voice is also lighter and kind of more in your face compared with the Empyrean IIs, with the bass being more distinctly separate. Where the Empyrean II is less intense in comparison, with maybe a slightly more bloated sound when reproducing the double bass. I switched earpads in the middle of the track in the Evening Mama, and the Alcantara earpads reduce the thickness of the sound significantly. The D8000s in comparison feel like they put the percussion in the background, whereas it feels more of a significant part of the music in the Empyrean II. Since it's a classic and well-known track and of high quality, I tried Massive Attack's Weather Storm from the Protection album. And it's a instrumental track which, well, unexpectedly, the D8000s have a massively overblown bass with this track. And that's one of the faults that the D8000s have, is that they have a particular peak in the bass, which sometimes, if it matches the peak of the bass in the music, can sound really overblown. Now, the Empyrean II it maintains its warm presentation, which I feel slightly crowds the piano in there. Now, switching to the Focal Utopias confirms that, yep, like with the Carmen Gomes, it's very much how the track is mastered. If it's mastered somewhat warm. The piano, of course, is more distinct through the French headphones, the Utopias. Now, a track that's shown up in a lot of my reviews is from Mark Ribot. And if I try and pronounce Spanish, I'll muck it, so I'll put the description in there as well. And Mark Ribot is a fantastic guitarist, and I really love his music. Now, this is one track that I could go either way with the earpads. Because it's mostly focused on the guitar, the Alcantara pads brought out more space, although I didn't notice the changes in the frequency response so much, because maybe there wasn't a lot of kind of mid-bass to reduce in there. But the interesting thing was they didn't lose the intimacy with the music, where, when you have guitar music, you really want to feel the guitar in your face, and anything that pushes that back can kind of reduce from the enjoyment of listening to it. Now, of course, onto some modern pop, and one that I've discovered is Andrea Triana. and has Danced the Pain Away. A really fantastic singer there, and I've got to try and go through some more of her stuff and find some more of her music that I really like, actually. It's from her Life in Colour album. Some modern pop, well, as I said, was definitely in order, as it tends to be mastered to be quite a bit brighter than the usual jazz and classical that I listen to. The bright mastering of this track can be, well, fatiguing quickly, and the Empyrean II kept it in check, which is the advantage of having warmer headphones, and with a choice of more bass thump with the dual ear pads, or more space and less of a thick sound with the Alcantara ones. Now, another pop track which I really like is You May Be Blue by Vetiver from their To Find Me Gone album. Now, this is the kind of modern music where the Empyrean II just finds its stride, just allowing you to groove to placid, slightly psychedelic and ambient beats without the need to over-focus on the fine details. Compared to the Elite, like with the Focal Utopias, the Elites provide a distinct jump up in clarity. The vocals are still pulled back a bit, and the mid-bass is still thick, but you have better space with the stock pads, helped to a large degree with a brighter sound signature. So that got me thinking, well, how much is these stock ear pads affecting my impression of that sound? So I did actually switch them to the Empyrean IIs to have a listen. And now I couldn't switch backwards and forwards quickly because obviously I only have one set to play around with. But what I did find is I still found the Elite did have a touch more detail and a touch more instrument separation with tracks when I switched backwards and forwards and listened a few times in the same track and switching the ear pads backwards and forwards between both pairs of headphones. But it does mean that the Empyrean sound to me somewhat closer to the Elites in terms of overall resolution. And while I could, on high-end gear obviously make out more detail with the Elites, it was somewhat of a close thing with a lot of music. And this is why I talk about high-quality music and the difference that, say, high-quality gear and high-quality music can make. One of the things that was most distinct about the Empyreans is they still weren't the clearest sounding headphones I've heard. Now, one of the interesting things was to listen to Stefan's impressions of what he thought between listening to his Empyreans, which he uses the original Alcantara pads on, and what he thought of the new Empyrean IIs with the dual ear pads.
Yeah, the difference in the bass is really I don't want to say it's murky on this one, but on the previous one, but this one it's more clear. You can hear. It's more isolated, the bass, something kind of. It's really it makes a big difference especially on that music, because the bass is really the part of the music, of the melody. I mean, it's stupid what I'm gonna say, because I really have the sensation to listen to the same headphone, like the comfort on the ear, the upper mid range is to me sounds the same. To me, but yeah, the bass just is better on the new one. Definitely, the definition, could say, is better. It's better. Not that it's bad. It's really nice on this one too. But yeah, there is definitely a big improvement, big change in terms of this. I always love the Empyrean because it puts me in like this bubble of sound, and I feel the same. So that's why I feel like I'm in the same universe. But yeah, a little bit. The bass is better on the number 2. This one, not this one. So yeah, I forgot. Yeah, the new one reveals the little imperfection of this one. It's very. It's disappointing. It's very interesting, because like when I switch from the 2 to the original, now the original there is less separation, and the sound, I would not say recessed because it's a little bit more recessed. Yeah.
Now, on paper, these are very easy to drive. Like the originals, they're 32 ohms. They have a sensitivity of 105 decibels per 1 volt, which means they'll drive out of pretty much anything, well, even something as simple as a phone, or probably more significantly, even a good dongle DAC. However, the quality of their amplification will make a lot of difference. It doesn't matter how much power something has on paper, as it's how well it drives the headphones that have more difference. I mean, you can get a small shit audio amp with, a few watts of output power, but even if that has on paper technically more power than my big Studio 6 or even the shit audio's Mjolnir, the headphone drive won't be nearly as good as, well, one of these big amps. If you saw, Stefan was using the Empyreans with a Luxman P750U headphone amplifier, which is a fantastic amplifier. I've been using them at least out of Chord's TT2 or Hugo 2 or this shit audio Mjolnir Mark III or the good old Studio 6, and even that it only has 1.2 watts of output power. I say only because it's way more that's necessary for these headphones. The headphone drive of these big amps is significantly greater than something like one of these small amps. The great thing is that these perform very well even out of something like a dongle DAC, something very simple which has, well, sufficient power, but maybe not quite as great headphone driving ability. Actually, one of the last devices I used with it is this Woo Audio Tube Mini, which has up to 1 watt of output power even if you plug it into a phone. When you plug a pair of Empyrean Mark IIs or any kind of high-end headphone with large drivers into something like a dongle DAC, one of the things that I noticed most significantly was somewhat less bass. And with that thicker sound, that seemed to balance things up a bit more, such that I actually found combinations such as this Woo Audio Tube Mini with the Empyreans actually to produce a slightly more even sound, which made them very easy to listen with. The other factor is these aren't the most detailed headphones, as I found listening to some other high-end models, which of course are more expensive, but some people may find, for example, the Sennheiser's HD800S behind me to have more overall detail, although the sound tuning of those may not be so great with, say, modern pop like I was listening to. They may sound too bright. So I found that overall the combination of the warmer tuning worked very well with things like dongle DACs or portable gear. That meant if you're the kind of person, which I've actually seen around a lot, who is willing to spend the money on high-end headphones, but not so willing to spend really great money on, say, digital gear and amplification, that you can actually run them very satisfactorily out of portable gear such as dongle DACs or things like this Woo Audio Tube Mini, or even a portable player if necessary, and get very satisfactory results. So given that how easy it is just to grab the Empyreans and plug them into, say, simple gear, I found it was very easy, that the whole combination made it great when I just pick up, say, the Tube Mini, plug it into my computer, plug in the Empyreans and just play some music, whether it be from YouTube or Apple Music or just through my Roon and Qobuz system, and I could just enjoy listening.
But I still want to know what makes me such a fool for you.